Welcome to Bioethics in the Margins. We are a group of bioethicists from different institutions across the country. This podcast represents our views and those of our guests, but we do not speak for our universities or medical centers, nor for any formalized bioethics organizations. Our mission is to bring marginalized topics and voices into the bioethics discourse. This podcast is hosted by Dr. Amelia Barwise, Associate Professor of Medicine and Assistant Professor of Biomedical Ethics at the Mayo Clinic, and Dr. Kirk Johnson, Assistant Professor of Justice Studies and Medical Humanities at Montclair State University. Please enjoy this conversation.
Well, welcome to another episode of Bioethics in the Margins, and we're really excited. This is our third episode for 2026, and we have a really special guest, Dr. Katherine Peeler. And she is an associate physician in the Division of Medical Critical Care at Boston Children's Hospital, and she's a member of the faculty of the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, where she teaches introductory bioethics and courses related to the intersection of bioethics and human rights. Dr. Peeler's research focuses on the health of detained immigrants in the United States. In particular, Dr. Peeler has studied detention and other custodial conditions of relief-seeking migrants in U.S. government custody, with the goal of informing policies to improve the health of these populations. She's a medical advisor for the non-profit organization Physicians for Human Rights and an active member in the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Immigrant, Child and Family Health. From 2022 to 23, Dr. Peeler was a fellow at the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics and fellow in residence at Harvard University's Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. She remained there as a Justice, Health and Democracy Impact Initiative Research Fellow, conducting research related to solitary confinement in immigration detention. She attended medical school at Dartmouth and received an MA in medical anthropology at Harvard University. She completed her residency, her pediatric residency at University of Michigan Mott Children's Hospital and pediatric critical care fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. She is co-editor of the book Voices from the Front Lines, The Pandemic and the Humanities. So you're very welcome. You've obviously got an amazing CV with so many different interests. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So can you just tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how you came to be so involved with Physicians for Human Rights?
Sure. I was not pre-med. I should start off by saying that. I was a history and French major in undergrad. Both my parents were physicians, and I was a surly teenager who just wanted to be the opposite of her parents for no particular reason. So it didn't occur to me to consider medicine. But as I went through college, I kind of realized that all of my work study jobs were always related to medicine and pediatrics, even kind of subconsciously. And so as I was nearing the end of college, I decided I did want to go to medical school. So I applied to do a post-baccalaureate pre-medical program, which is what I did for the following 2 years. But during that, when I was taking some electives, I took medical anthropology, which I did not know what that was at the time. And it was great. And it really resonated with me as a field. And I started reading works mainly by Paul Former, who unfortunately has since passed away. But when I was reading his books, he also wasn't famous yet. Tracy Kidder hadn't written Mountains Beyond Mountains. And so I would drive up to Boston to go to these little Partners in Health events, and there would be like me and 3 other people. And so through his works, I started really thinking a lot more about human rights. And I learned about Physicians for Human Rights, which at the time was also based in Boston. And although I really liked Partners in Health's model of delivering care to those who normally did not have access to such high quality care, I really loved the idea of investigating human rights abuses as they pertain to health to try to bring a lens of evidence to those human rights abuses to try to change policy. That was really interesting to me, and that's what Physicians for Human Rights, or PHR, did and still does. And so I started just learning more and more about their work in a lot of different domains. And for whatever reason, I was really interested particularly in their work related to people who are seeking asylum in the United States. And kind of fast forward 20 years, I've been volunteering and working with them ever since.
And you also run the Peeler Immigration Lab, and you kind of bring those two together. So what do you do in the Peeler Immigration Lab, and who's based there?
Yeah, the Peeler Immigration Lab is It's really a group of people. So essentially, at the start of the pandemic, you and I were talking a little bit offline about how this podcast started a bit during the pandemic. So similarly, as the pandemic was beginning, I was just talking to some medical students at the time, and we were thinking about, how awful it was just in general. And then we were thinking about how terrible it really must be in immigration detention, how scary it must be to be going through this in that particular environment. And so we were curious about what that was like and wanted to get more information and more data. And so that group of students and I, so medical students, anthropology students, business students, all different graduate students at Harvard started meeting. And we devised a study to look at, to interview people about their experiences during the pandemic in immigration detention. And we started meeting every week and decided to call ourselves a lab. So it kind of happened organically. And then since then, we've done several other studies, both qualitative and quantitative, and have written lots of op-eds. And our goal really, my goal is to teach students how they can kind of use their expertise, whether it be in medicine or business or anthropology, to write for a public and policy-facing audience opposed to an academic audience. I think an academic audience is very important as well for a lot of different reasons, but I think that writing for a public audience is also an important skill that may be less taught in academia, even though we rely on academics' expertise in courts of law and other public-facing places. And so my goal was to try to give a different outlet for students to use their burgeoning expertise, to learn about that, and to use their voices that way. And then our kind of common goal was to really try to understand and investigate various human rights and bioethical and other medical related issues that were occurring in detention or otherwise related to asylum seekers in real time, to try to influence policy in real time. And so that's what we do. And the work kind of ebbs and flows depending on what's going on. Students also graduate, and so we get new students, which is exciting, and get a different kind of combination of voices as time goes on.
So we did want to talk about one of the reports that you did work on with those groups, endless nightmare, torture and inhumane treatment and solitary confinement in US immigration detention. So in that, and that kind of brings us up to about 2024, I believe, that report, you say that ICE oversaw more than 14,000 placements in solitary confinement between 2018 and 2023. Many of them had various vulnerabilities, which we're going to discuss in a bit more detail. The average duration of solitary confinement was extremely long, about 1 month, which goes against various federal and global recommendations. So tell us a little bit more about what you call solitary confinement in ICE, although they have a different term that maybe you can tell us about. What is this and when is it used?
Sure. So solitary confinement, the kind of generally accepted definition, is the isolation of an individual for 22 hours or more per day in an environment that they cannot control. So in a small enclosed space, usually these spaces tend to be the size of a parking space. Like if you drove into the grocery store and you parked in a parking space, imagine that space totally enclosed and locked. And without the ability to change the temperature or the lighting or anything along those lines. The 22 hours is important because sometimes places will keep you in solitary confinement for 21 hours and may not count it as a solitary confinement day if it doesn't meet that 22-hour threshold. But that's the generally accepted definition. ICE maintains, if you have a conversation with members of ICE, that they don't have solitary confinement. They would argue that what they have is something called segregation. And their policies are labeled segregation policies. They have directives and memoranda and memos that are all related to their segregation policy. They also will use, in terms of other words that they use to describe this, they will use the word special housing, restricted housing. And so you'll also hear people who have spent time in segregation refer to it as the SHU, which is the special housing unit. So there's lots of different words that are used, but they are synonymous. So ICE would maintain that this is not a euphemism for solitary confinement. They feel very, very strongly about that. We and many others disagree and feel that it is a euphemism because while ICE feels that you have access to the same resources in the general population as you do in segregation, that's just simply not borne out by interviews with other individuals who have been in segregation or in solitary. They don't have the same access to religious services, to library services, to the amount of time outside. So it's not the same. And this is also borne out not just by interviews with people who've been in solitary, but also by external inspectors who've come and inspected ICE's facilities, such as the Office of Inspector General or the Government Accountability Office.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peeler. So I know that, of course, language is very important. And because they use all of these particular terminologies, they meaning, of course, the staff, the law enforcement in ICE, how does, I guess we could term this linguistic displacement, if you will, complicate health professionals' ability to intervene? Because in one word, this is segregation, this is solitary confinement, these are special managed, like all of these different terminologies. It doesn't make it difficult for health professionals to intervene in these particular circumstances.
It can make it difficult. Yeah. I mean, you need to know what you're talking about in any conversation with anyone, right? We need to always know we're on the same page. I will say, I've been in conversations with members of people who work for ICE, and they will start out the conversation by they will take time to say, we just want to make sure that you understand that we don't practice solitary confinement, and it's not a euphemism, and here's what we do, and here's why it's different. And you could take that either one of two ways. You could just refuse to acknowledge how they feel about that, and then not proceed to have a conversation because you both think you're talking about two different things. Or you can say, I hear that you feel this is not a euphemism. I feel that it is, but let's talk about segregation. Let's talk about your policy of what you call segregation and what we found about these segregation policies. Because I think it's important to both call out something for what it is, which is what we do in our reports. We spend a lot of time on definitions. We spend a lot of time explaining what solitary confinement is, what the definition is, and then going through why ICE's policies of segregation meet the definition of solitary confinement, and therefore we're going to call it solitary confinement. But we also make sure to list all the names that they use, because also not only is it important for talking about the same thing, but also it's important, like you said, for other people who are doing research or who are reading the paper. They need to know that when they see a certain word that actually means this, or they see another word, it's actually the same thing. Because if you just hear the word special housing, first of all, that sounds kind of nice, right? But it's not nice. But second of all, even if you didn't think it sounded nice, you just don't know what that means. It's very non-descriptive. And certainly special housing, to me, does not sound like that would be the same as restricted housing, right? And so definitions are important, and then also understanding which words are synonyms, et cetera, to be able to speak the same language and to have a productive conversation. My general tactic is when I talk to ICE, I feel like I'm very aware of how they define segregation and how they feel that it is different. And I think if we can have a more productive conversation by calling it segregation, that's okay, because what I want to do is reform their segregation policy. I feel their segregation is solitary confinement, but ultimately my goal is to improve upon their policies to try to create less harm for people. And so that's the end goal.
Okay. Do you think it's and thank you for your answer. Do you think it's intentional regarding the language? Because of course the immigration system combined with the criminal justice system, I believe the term is crimmigration. I'm pretty sure you heard of that particular term. And usually it's not for rehabilitation. It's usually for punishment in some particular way. In many cases, and I guess is connecting to my next question, is very inhumane. So, do you think it's intentional to have all these different definitions and terminologies to thwart or hinder the type of reforms that need to be in place in this system? Or, I guess, do you think it's just a pure coincidence? There's so many different terminologies and languages that are being used, or definitions that are being used.
I don't think it's to thwart or hinder, because I think that ICE knows that immigrant health researchers and advocates and lawyers know what this practice is and understand the system pretty well. So I don't think that they feel like the language is going to hinder anyone's ability to understand what's going on. I do think that they fundamentally think that it is different. When I've spoken to people who've worked at ICE, they will talk about how, prior to working at ICE, they worked in like a very different kind of military complex in like a war zone. And they're like, this is what solitary confinement is, Dr. Peeler. And so they will compare, and the thing that they're describing is probably functionally different, but they're both solitary confinement. One includes, purposefully torturing people, and the other one indirectly amounts to torture, to Amelia's point earlier about the amount of time. But they have different characteristics. But just because they have different characteristics does not mean that they don't both meet the definition of solitary confinement. But their point is that there are differences. I think just because one thing is bad and one thing is worse doesn't mean that one should remain and the other one shouldn't, right? If both things are bad in different ways, then they're both bad. The end. We should not do them. And so to me, the distinction between different types of solitary confinement is kind of missing the point. I do think that they think it's fundamentally different. I think they use segregation because they don't want to admit that it's solitary confinement. I don't think they're trying to hinder or thwart, but I think that they do not want to say this is solitary confinement. They feel they don't want to admit that, and they prefer their terminology. But so I think it is to obfuscate a little bit, but more so along the lines of kind of hiding in plain sight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I know that you occupy a lot of different spaces. You're pediatric intensivist, you're a bioethicist, you're also a medical anthropologist, and a lead researcher on this particular report. All at one time. So you're wearing many hats and experiencing many different perspectives and lenses in this type of work. And in medical humanities, we believe or we know about the moral cost borne by clinicians who witness suffering they cannot immediately remedy, right? This is not just professional, but when you see the harms that are being done, it could be really hard to experience and to witness. I'm curious, and I'm when I read your particular article, and it's an excellent article, so I encourage everyone to read it.
Thank you.
I will get the title up so folks could download it if they're able to. But it did speak of a woman that was isolated for 142 days because the officials said that she was taking up valuable bed space, right? And also a man who died after nearly 4 years in isolation. And I really am curious about your perspective of this, as we term it, a clinical moral injury, right? Do you think these are human rights violations? And what is your particular perspective on human rights in regards to this particular immigration system that we are currently experiencing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there are many human rights violations that are going on right now, kind of backing up even further away from the article about solitary confinement. We're functionally not allowing people to seek asylum in this country right now, right? Even though that is both a part of international law that we have signed on to, as well as part of U.S. domestic law. And, I don't want to speak too out of turn. I'm not an attorney, but those are pretty basic facts of U.S. immigration law. And we have functionally closed that system down. Secondly, from a detention standpoint, we are, in terms of solitary confinement, it is the Mandela rules, which are part of the United Nations rules about the appropriate treatment of prisoners, stipulate many things, one of which is appropriate medical care, which we know is not happening given the record number of deaths that occurred in 2025 with 33 people who died under ICE's custody, including the many number of people who are not reported upon who are sick and who are currently suffering from many morbidities right now. But those are less in the news because those people have not died, as well as the children that we see who've been sick in ICE custody. But then getting closer to the article in terms of solitary confinement, both that study, the Endless Nightmare, as well as our follow-up study that came out this past fall, Cruelty Campaign, showed that, the average length of a single stint in solitary confinement or segregation well exceeds the 2-week limit that the UN considers torture per the Mandela rules. And the Mandela rules really stipulate that you shouldn't use solitary confinement at all. And if you use it, it needs to be used for the shortest amount of time possible because it's always harmful, even from the very first hour that you're in there. And it should certainly not exceed 2 weeks, which ICE actually has a specific definition for. That the 2-week mark is considered extended segregation, which shows you that they are very well aware of how the international community considers the lengths of solitary confinement or segregation. And so that's occurring a lot. Not only is the average duration, as we found in that first study, around a month, and that was borne out both in the FOIA-related quantitative data that we looked at, as well as the qualitative interviews of the people who we spoke to. But there are many, many long stints. You mentioned the woman who was in there for about 140 or 50 days, and then there was people who were in there for several years. There was a gentleman who died in Tacoma, Washington, after almost 4 consecutive years in solitary confinement and immigration detention. And that was on top of many years he'd spent in solitary confinement in the Bureau of Prisons before he even went to ICE detention. So we're seeing human rights abuses kind of left and right as it pertains to different aspects of people's care who are trying to go through our immigration system.
So what type of recommendations? I know you mentioned that you have updated that and you published another report in September 2025, which we'll also be putting on our website. But what recommendations did you make in the original versus the new one? You changed your recommendations slightly. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, we had kind of several categories of recommendations. So Physicians for Human Rights reports always end with targeted recommendations for specific audience members, right? So it'll say something like, to the United Nations, please investigate XYZ. To Congress, please do this. To the President, do this. To ICE, do this. And so we had focused on a lot of different things. The first go round, we were interested in increased oversight. So the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties often investigates various complaints that come to them, either individually or when they've noticed a pattern. Not too long ago, there was the creation of an ombuds office. We'll get to both those offices in a minute. There's some updates about those offices, but that was supposed to also similarly hear complaints and to understand what's going on in detention. So we asked for those offices to have increased oversight powers and for their recommendations to have some teeth, because not all recommendations that were made by CRCL, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, actually were enforceable. They were recommended. And so we asked for those oversight bodies to have a little bit more oomph behind what they were able to see and recommend. We asked for there to be more independent committees and councils of, clinicians, psychologists, et cetera, to understand how the health system was working and to provide some guidance. We asked for much better documentation. We found that some of the data systems that ICE keeps for solitary confinement, which should be additive. There's some information that comes daily, there's some information that comes quarterly, and those should all be the same numbers, right? Just reported at different times. They were not the same. And so it just shows that there were gaps in the data. And so we asked for better record keeping and then better public reporting of that data. We asked for changes in how they report the data, which I'll get to in the second report. And we asked for President Biden to live up to his campaign promise of when he campaigned to be president, he campaigned about ending solitary confinement across all types of centers, which he didn't do. So we asked him to not forget about that. And we asked Congress to consider legislation. The second report we put out, we don't typically do reports on the same topic in that quick succession, but we felt that actually there were a few important reasons to do so. The second report, there was a new president, right? We had switched back to Trump 2.0. Additionally, there was a different way that ICE was reporting the data. So previously, ICE was only reporting solitary publicly. They were recording it, but they were only publicly reporting solitary confinement stints for people who were considered vulnerable. So those with mental health disorders or serious mental health disorders who were transgender. This is again before Trump 2.0 got rid of the concept of transgender, which you cannot be in immigration detention anymore. But if you're considered vulnerable, those stints would be publicly reported from the very day that you were placed, as opposed to people in the general population who were not considered vulnerable. You only got to know if they were in solitary confinement if it was for 2 weeks or longer. And so we knew that in December 2024, they changed that so that all stints of all people were going to be reported from the first day. So we knew the denominator was going to suddenly increase, but whether or not it was actually increasing or if it was just a reporting change, we wanted to study that over time once the denominator had kind of been newly reset. And so with all those changes in mind, we felt like it was important to look at the data again, or the updated data. We found very similar results, unfortunately, increasing use of solitary confinement, increasing use even after the denominator was reset over the first several full months of the Trump administration, as well as compared to the last few months of the Biden administration. Still similarly very long lengths of solitary confinement. And unfortunately, despite there being protections as written by ICE to protect vulnerable people from solitary confinement specifically, knowing how bad it is for them, they were disproportionately being placed in solitary confinement compared to the general population. And so the recommendations, some of them were very similar because we were happy that the reporting had increased, right? That we had this newer and more complete data set, but there were still problems with the data set. So we still wanted improved data. And, right now, what we would really like is not just better oversight, but any oversight at all. So since the Trump administration has taken place, most of those oversight offices have really been gutted. So the Office of the Detention Ombuds has really been gutted. I think there's like 1 or 2 people in that office now. They just testified about this in front of Congress in February. Same with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, that has functionally been gutted. And so all of these oversight offices that we really rely upon to understand what's going on, including Congress people, right? You can no longer be a congressperson who shows up at a detention center and give an unannounced visit the way you were supposed to be able to before, and still are supposed to be able to, but are no longer being allowed to do. Now, even since we wrote the report, the oversight has really just gone by the wayside. So we would love more oversight in general, not just for solitary confinement, but to understand what's going on in detention in general. And then the last and final recommendation I would say out of both reports is to release people. Kirk, you had mentioned earlier about immigration, but immigration detention is really unique and different. I don't think anyone should be in solitary confinement ever. Or if they really need to be to de-escalate, it should be for an extremely short and limited amount of time, like hours to 1 or 2 days. And there have been many places that have studied getting rid of solitary confinement as a common tool, and they have shown much greater rates of staff happiness. They've shown no increase in violence among inmates. These are in prison populations. And so it can be done, is the point. And so I think that the bar really should be to get rid of solitary confinement. We don't need it as a common tool. It is vastly overused. And until then, the best way to have people not be at risk for being placed in solitary confinement is to not have them in detention. And so since immigration detention is an administrative detaining of people, right? It is not, very few people who are there have criminal convictions. Some do, but most do not. The majority do not. The majority are administratively or non-criminally detained. And so ICE has the discretion at any time to let people go. It is not a law that you have to put people in detention. It is a policy, and it is a discretionary policy. And so if ICE wanted to release people to go through their various immigration processes through the general court system and make it so that people weren't scared about being deported if they showed up to court, you would have a much healthier kind of public health environment. You would have people not exposed to solitary confinement. You would have people with agency to get their own medical care if they wanted to, which would prevent many of the deaths in detention. And you would not need all this staff that we currently don't have anyway in these detention centers. Our main recommendation has always been to decarcerate, to release people from detention, the vulnerable people first, right? That those with mental illness and LGBTQ positive people, and then others as well, because that is the best way to eliminate solitary confinement, is to not be at risk of it to begin with.
But of course, we know that the budget for ICE has increased enormously. So that's unfortunately the way things are going. You've talked to, certainly for your first report, you did talk to several people. So your report was based on those numbers that you said, and there were various discrepancies in the quantitative data. Mm-hmm. And now the data is maybe being collected more accurately, but there's no oversight, so nothing can really be implemented to kind of improve conditions. What kind of things did the people who'd been in these facilities say? And, I think we've touched on this a little bit, the short and the long-term impacts of being in solitary confinement.
Yeah, it was really hard to do these interviews, as you can imagine. And people said lots of different things. They talked about like the reasons why they were placed in solitary confinement. So there's both. ICE has two kind of categories of solitary confinement: administrative segregation and disciplinary segregation. So disciplinary is what it sounds like it is, right? If you break some sort of rule within ICE, you potentially, the result is being placed in solitary, but the bar is supposed to be pretty high. It's supposed to be for really kind of serious, kind of violent offenses. And even then, they're supposed to try other things first before placing you in segregation. It's not supposed to be for minor offenses. And then administrative segregation is other reasons. So it might be that someone has requested to be separated from the general population. Maybe they themselves don't feel safe among the general population for whatever reason. They've asked to be separated. Maybe they have an infectious illness and ICE has run out of its isolation rooms in the medical unit. And so they've opted to use solitary confinement as an isolation room. That's a allowable use of it per ICE's policies, even though I would say that's not a great way to treat someone medically. But they have administrative reasons and disciplinary reasons. And so what we heard from people is that those guidelines were frequently not followed. People were placed in solitary confinement for disciplinary reasons for things that were really minor, kissing, using profanity. Even the Office of Inspector General, when they did it, when there was a prior report prior to ours, found that ICE would document the reasons for placing someone in disciplinary segregation were really minor. ICE documented that they placed someone in disciplinary segregation for taking food out of the cafeteria, which maybe there's a rule that you're not supposed to take food out of the cafeteria. Does that warrant placing someone in solitary confinement? Doesn't seem like it. And this is ICE's own documentation. This is not someone, blowing out of proportion what they perceived as why they were placed in solitary confinement. This is ICE's documenting it themselves on their paperwork. So people talked about that. They talked about being placed in solitary confinement as retribution. If they were perceived as being a, quote, agitator or leader, like if they felt like they were, one person described speaking up for their and everyone else's rights for more information about COVID, because we also learned a lot about solitary during our COVID study, or if they said, we want more masks, or we don't want the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We've read about it and we've heard that it's not so great, and why only be offered, like they had things they were asking for that seemed like maybe they weren't going to get them, but they were reasonable to be asking about them. And if they were perceived as being a leader, they would be asked to be stopped. And if they didn't stop, they would be placed in solitary. People were placed in solitary confinement for suicide watch, for being on hunger strike, all sorts of things that have a lot of bioethical complications to consider. And then in terms of the actual experience, people said they just kind of couldn't. They had a really hard time describing in words how awful it was, just the sheer loneliness and the just how crazy it made them feel. Honestly, that was like some of the words that some people said. The inability to, like if you were freezing, the inability to make yourself warmer, like if you didn't have a blanket and if your correctional officer decided not to give you a blanket. Some might give it to you if you knocked on the door and said that you want something, but some may not. The inability to turn off the light if you wanted to go to sleep because the lights were out of your control, and people described the lights being on sometimes 24 hours a day, sometimes 20 hours a day. They described, we talked earlier about how the resources are not the same, despite the fact that ICE would say they were. Many people described not being able to practice their religion in solitary confinement. So not only were they not able to leave to go to religious services, but they didn't even have access to things that they may need. One man in particular, who's Muslim, reported to me that he had asked for a Quran, and he was told it was going to be, I think, $40. But if he wanted a Bible, it would be free, which I found so just horribly offensive and gross. But like small but big indignities like happened a lot. People described that a lot. One person described that his toilet was unable to be flushed by him. Some people said that they could flush their own toilet. That was no problem. But one person described that he didn't have access to flush his own toilet. It had to be flushed by the correctional officer, the CO outside. And so he would bang on the door and say like, CO, toilet. And sometimes a person would, but sometimes there was one CO in particular who was just like, nope, that's your own shit. You're going to have to live with it. And he just wouldn't flush the toilet just because he knew that he didn't have to. And he knew that it was a power thing to do. And so it just was awful. People really described awful things. And some people described really feeling out of control. Like they would just get very heightened and they could tell their heart was racing and they would get really scared and agitated. And then they would be perceived as being out of control. And so they would be placed in solitary longer, as opposed to what they really needed was to be released and to have like a normal environment again.
I just have one more question before I pass back to Kirk. So thank you for explaining all that. So it seems that there are more of these ICE detention facilities being built. Is there anything that state and municipal governments can do, in terms of inspection or preventing them being built? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that question. That's something that I have only recently started. I've thought about it a bit from a state level before, but I just recently have started thinking about it more from a local level. But that's something I would love to do more research on in the future. And if anyone listening already does that and needs more help, let me know. I'm happy to help. But, there are states that have enacted some policies. So California is the example that I usually give that has a statewide policy in place whereby the state attorney general has the ability and the prerogative and the kind of legal authority to inspect detention facilities in the state. And so they do. And as a result, there is more data in the California detention system because you can get it through California than through other systems. And you can compare what California has versus like what ICE releases about its California facilities. And some researchers have done this. There's a lot of researchers in Southern California who do a lot of really great research on immigration detention, and they use their state level data a lot. So I think if more states passed policies and laws stating that we want to have independent oversight, that would be great. I think the other thing that local places can do, which you've seen a lot with all these like AI centers coming up, is you've seen there's been a lot of reporting in the news of like town councils and local townspeople attending town council meetings who never attended before, saying like, nope, we are going to sit here and we're going to protest because we do not want you to grant this permit. And a lot more has been reported about that in terms of these data farms and elsewhere, because people worry about the infrastructure to their community in terms of traffic, in terms of energy use, in terms of water for the rest of people if it's all being diverted to these centers, all sorts of things that are definitely outside of my area of expertise, but I've just been reading a lot about in the news. And so I think there's certainly a parallel to that. And there is, now I'm going to forget. There is I think it's called Project Saltbox, which is an immigration watchdog group, and they track a lot. I think that they are in Maryland, and maybe New Jersey, but they track they track a lot of things, but they track the various warehouses that are trying to be popped up right now, and they try to understand which permits they have or have not applied for, and which ones the townspeople know they have or have not applied for. And so I think there's a lot of I think it's really important for local voters to understand what these detention centers mean for the people who are being detained. That's my main concern from like a humanitarian perspective, because they're not set up to kind of house people in a humane manner, which they should be. And then also what it means for the resources in a community, not in a not in my backyard kind of way, that I'm less interested in, but in a just, this is a poor use of resources. Like, we shouldn't be detaining people and treating them inhumanely. And you should know that your taxpayer dollars are being used to treat people inhumanely. And if you disagree with that for a wide variety of reasons, then I think it's important for people to speak up and try to tell their elected officials to not give them permits, not give them building permits, electricity, all the different permits that one needs. So I think there's a lot of room for state and local lawmaking to intervene.
I know, absolutely. I see that your report cites decades of longitudinal research demonstrating that solitary confinement produces, again, these are the psychological and mental health consequences, right? Which clearly, these are very, very hard, traumatic experiences. And the consequences are, lasting brain damage, disrupted cognition, hallucinations, and an elevated risk of suicide. And these effects persist long after release, right? So it's not that you just leave and then you're okay. The traumatic experience continue to persist, unfortunately, in these individuals' lives. And you said sometimes for years or decades. And when I read that, I find myself thinking not just about a detention practice, but about the state deliberately, even if indirectly altering, as you said, the neurobiology of human beings who have not been convicted of any crime at all. And this really speaks volumes of a system that is legally classified as civil, but definitely not punitive. So, from your perspective as a clinician who works at the intersections of bioethics and human rights, do you think is that a categorization, the state as a neurobiological actor producing permanent harm? Do you think this is a fair, categorization? And if so, what does bioethics owe us as a field in responding to it? And I know this is a philosophical question. Some individuals feel that bioethics should just be theoretical. Some argue that bioethics should be practical. Like, we have to actually apply what we're teaching in situations like this or any situations of injustice. I know that was a long comment and question, but I just want to provide context on your thoughts on the psychological consequences of the system.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question. I think I like the philosophical questions, and I think they're important. And I don't want to. I think there is a real importance in thinking, which I think we do less of now than we used to. Right. So most of the time, I'm generally interested in the applied version of any field, physiology, anthropology, bioethics. But I do want to say I worry a little bit that there is a lot of application and sometimes we are getting away from the thinking. So I applaud all the bioethicists that are still doing like the deep, hard normative thinking, because we need that. And I think it's important. And I think we really need that for the next generation of people to understand why they think what they think and why they maybe want to change their mind about something. That being said, I do feel that, the state, and I can't remember exactly the term you used, but like the state certainly is an actor in causing harm here. It is deliberately causing harm, right? We've known for a long time, it's in policy documents that we are trying to halt immigration through deterrence. That's not new. It's not even secret, right? We have done that by building walls. We have done that by making the walls dangerous. We have done that by forcing people to, if they're going to try to cross over the southern border, to come through the desert, which we know is dangerous and dehydrating and lethal. We have done it by having this policy of detention, which is not a law, but we know is used as a deterrent. We have done it by separating children from their families and having formal family separation policies. We've done it by making it really scary to go to your asylum appointment because there might be an ICE agent there who's going to deport you. We have all of these deterrent techniques to try to scare people. And so it is certainly purposeful. Harm is purposeful. The harm is meant to deter people. I had someone ask me recently if they think that ICE is denying people care in detention centers to say, like, well, if you self-deport, maybe you'll get more care where you go. I don't have an answer to that, but I'm just saying, like, it's a question that's being posed. And so the state is purposeful in its general harms. In its specific harm, it knows that solitary confinement is bad for you. That's why it has definitions for extended segregation versus regular segregation. It knows that it's particularly bad for certain classes of people, which is why it has specific memoranda and directives protecting people who need extra protections, people with serious mental illness, people with serious physical comorbidities, people who are transgender, who are LGBTQ. So they know these harms, and despite that, they continue to inflict it. I think bioethics has a real role in both looking at these. I am less interested in saying like something is ethical or unethical, because almost everything that occurs in a detention center is unethical. I don't personally feel like there's a lot to study there. People have written very interesting and eloquent articles, and I like reading them, but I think that like we've settled that argument. But I do think that bioethics has something to offer in terms of language and in terms of discussion. I hope. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to study right now with my fellow statist at the Greenwald Foundation, is trying to see if bioethics can be an applied field towards mitigating some of these harms. Because historically, we have gone about trying to identify these harms through a human rights lens. And I love that lens, obviously. I've dedicated all of my life towards understanding and using that lens, and I think that lens is important and don't want to get rid of it at all. But I also think that sometimes, from a conversational standpoint, we as a society really dig our heels in about rights, individual rights versus group rights, my rights versus your rights, all sorts of things and all different types of topics. And so sometimes it can be a conversational non-starter to start that way, even if I think that needs to be an important part of the conversation. Kind of like your question earlier about language. I think it's important to understand the language, and then it's important, once you know what you're all talking about, to try to find a way to have the conversation. If you get stuck on the language and never have the conversation, then you aren't going to get anywhere. And so I find it really interesting to watch an amazing bioethics consult, like at the bedside. I'm not saying that I'm the one doing the consult, I'm the one watching the consult. But I find watching a really excellent clinical bioethicist just fascinating, because they are so good at managing conversations between people who totally disagree and have different values, and they're not trying to come up with a compromise or a solution that will make everyone happy, because that's probably not going to happen, but they're trying to have everyone understand where everyone else is coming from, so that the solution that they come up with, or the process or next step they come up with, is at least as palatable as it can be to the most number of people. And so I think that if we could translate that process and the way that bioethics thinks about values to policy conversations, particularly around immigration, I am hopeful that would be an applied use of bioethics towards decreasing the harms of the state and trying to find, honestly, like the best in people who are making policies and trying to understand where each other is coming from. I don't think that I'm not going to be kind of Pollyannish about this, and that I think that everyone's always coming from a good place, because I'm sure they're not. But I think that there is more to people than we give them credit for. And I think if we can use bioethics as a way to understand shared values and to have more productive conversations, that maybe we would find a way to mitigate some of these harms in a way that makes all different sides of the equation feel better about what they're doing.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, absolutely. So, of course, we need to have the conversations, right? We need the theoretical, but also, what I'm hearing is that we also need the application, right? We also need to do something. Now, of course, you could argue what to do, but I guess for us to do absolutely nothing or not to do anything is also equally problematic as well. So, thank you for that question. And every time we have these really difficult conversations, those two philosophies always come into play: the theoretical, but also the application in bioethics. So, thank you very much for your response. My last question obviously is about following the money, right? There's always a paper trail.
Yeah.
And one particular foundational law that I think set the precedence for so much money coming in, and as Amelia and you discussed earlier about this funding, I remember in the 1994 federal crime bill, under Bill Clinton's administration, and of course it passed, it really set that infrastructure, the financial monetization of not just mass incarceration, the criminal justice system, but also that definitely transferred into the immigration system as well. And I'm just curious on your thoughts of, these private prisons that obviously are profiting from this type of system. Should there be, pretty sure of what your answer is, but I would like to hear it from you. Should there be some type of really a law, a policy, legislation that actually ban private prisons, right? You are literally profiting. We heard all of the horrible stories that you have talked about and experiences people have endured and are currently enduring now during the recording of this podcast, right? In this system. Should these private prisons should be banned? Or I could re-clarify my question on how do you think, what are some recommendations you think on banning these type of private prisons so that they won't make a profit off of people suffering?
Yeah, the private for-profit prison corporations are not my favorite, to put it lightly. They're I know I don't can be blunt. I
You can be
would be.
blunt.
I feel like you said it all. But so their number one motive is profit, right? That they are for-profit corporations. They have shareholders. They have a board that they are beholden to, and so their incentive is always to minimize cost and to maximize profit. And minimizing cost comes at the cost of those who are there they are caring for. So the incentive is to keep bed numbers up, right? The more beds they have, the more people detained, the more money they make. And that there's all sorts of ripple effects. The more people that you deport, then the more empty beds you can kind of fill with more people that you can then detain. And so there's kind of this circular kind of mill. They are really interested in keeping going because it helps them have more money. There's a real disincentive to send people for outside care, like medical care, because ICE bears the brunt of that cost, which is often kind of shared with these corporations. And so they try to keep people in-house, and that leads to delays in emergency care or delays in diagnosis of chronic important illnesses. I have a real concern that is part of the reason of these 33 deaths this past year. We've seen places into private detention centers where they don't use all the space that they have because it's easier to keep everyone in smaller spaces if they're not at capacity, because then they can use fewer staff, but they do that at the cost of people passing around infectious diseases that they would otherwise be able to spread out with. So there's all sorts of disincentives for good care with a private for-profit prison system. I think the two things that are important to me are Well, I mean, I think we need many, many, many fewer people incarcerated in this country, period, everywhere. Detention, prison, jail. Like, you pick your incarceration system. There's too many people. And we need to find a way to your point, back from Bill Clinton's era and even earlier, we need a way to stop having so many people in our country incarcerated. I do not study the rest of the incarceration system, so that's where I'll end my comments there, but that's how I feel about that. But from an immigration detention, where it's even easier to decarcerate because, again, it's a discretionary holding. If you massively decarcerated, the way we did a little bit during the pandemic, right? There were a lot of lawsuits that got many of the detention centers decarcerated, both children who were being taken out of ORR custody, as well as adults who were decarcerated from ICE custody during the pandemic as a public health mitigation measure. And then we rapidly recarcerated, and then more since then. But it can be done, is my point. But if you really drastically limited who you're detaining for a very high bar and specific reasons, you wouldn't need private for-profit prison corporations. ICE has detention centers that are not run, not every single one of their centers is run by a private for-profit prison corporation. If you had many fewer people, ICE would be able to do what they need to do on their own. Again, I would prefer you not detain anyone at all, but you would eliminate the need. But I think right now there is so much lobbying money being spent by these corporations to keep their businesses alive. And they're very creative. They also are in the market of alternatives to detention. Like, who do you think profits from all the ankle monitors and all the cell phone apps that keep track of people who are on these alternative detention programs? It's the same players. And so they will find a way to make a profit regardless of how we track people, whether it be in carceral states or non-carceral states. And it's inhumane and it's gross, honestly. And so I don't have ideas for how to get rid of them, but I do feel strongly that they are a real strong player in keeping this system alive and getting worse. And so I think if anyone has ideas for how to get rid of that from a legislative standpoint, I would happily help. But that now we're way beyond my area of expertise.
Thank you. Go ahead, Amelia. I think that's my last question. So.
Well, I was going to just wrap it up, unless you have another question. I was just going to say, well, congratulations on your Scholar Award at Greenwall. That's amazing, and good luck with that work. And thank you so much for doing all these comprehensive reports, which seem to be a huge amount of work, and it's just unbelievable to be collating all that information and sharing it for the public knowledge. And so I really appreciate that as well, because it's a lot more work than academic articles from what I can see. So thank you so much.
Oh, they're both a lot of work, but thank you.
Absolutely. And for our readers, because I did promise this, if you would like to read what Dr. Peeler, one of Dr. Peeler's many different reports and publications, we referred to endless nightmare, torture, and inhumane treatment in solitary confinement in U.S. immigration detention by PHR. So, which PHR means Physicians for Human Rights. So I believe you could just type it in Google Scholar, Google it, or go to your local library online website to check that out. Excellent read. It's really informative. And yes, so much is left to be said because I could go on. But thank you so much, Dr. Peeler, for your time, your expertise, and also your perspective in this this timely issue that we're seeing right now in our country.
Thank you both for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another great conversation on bioethics in the margins. This podcast is hosted by Amelia Barwise and Kirk Johnson. Our producer is Elizabeth Chung. Our editor is Madeline Mahoney. Our theme music was written and produced by Pablo Cortes. We are grateful for the assistance of Wendy Jung, and Gargi Pandey is our creative director. Nicole Strand is our advisor, and Steven Sadecki is our senior advisor. Join us again next time.